Welcome to the YouTube replay from our Green Drinks January 2022 session on climate action. We welcomed Kirtstin Pulles from Efficiency Canada, Evan Pivnik from Clean Energy Canada, and Lauren Latour from the Climate Action Network. Enjoy this replay.
Buddy to Virtual Green Drinks January 2022, the first one of the year. And for this one, we're going to be talking climate action. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Nick Hebb with SmartNet Alliance. And the Alliance is a group of businesses and organizations who collaborate on projects and initiatives to help accelerate Canada's transition to a sustainable economy. So for more information on SNA, please consult our website, which I'll share into chat shortly. And be sure to check out our member pages. We've got members working in lots of different sectors: home building, battery technology, solar, energy advising, all to all bunch. So check out our member pages. I'll put a link in there as well. It's a great place to start if you are looking at some sustainable solutions. So for Virtual Green Drinks January, we start the year off with a very important topic: climate action. With COP26 in the rear view, now is the time to get laser focused on our climate goals. What is going on in our community and what organizations are out there to help? These are some of the questions we'll be answering. We'll be joined by 3 leaders in the field of climate action. And first up, we welcome Kirtstin Pulles. She began her career organizing at the age of 18. Well done. When she traveled to the US for 3 months, living out of a van and advocating for North Korean human rights. Since then, she has completed a bachelor's degree in global and international studies at Carleton University, focusing on the nexus of economic growth, equity, and sustainability. That brought her to Efficiency Canada, where she is currently a community organizer. She's helping with the energy efficiency sector become a political force to be reckoned with in Canadian politics. So come on in, Kirstin. It's going to be a great presentation. Thanks so much for joining us. You should be able to unmute and share your screen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for that great introduction. I feel like more than most people know about me when I start talking. So everyone gets to have the whole background, which is great. So just gonna clear my screen up here, and we've got
absolutely, and we're seeing and hearing your screen great. So thanks so much.
Awesome, great. I will take it away. So what I want to talk to everyone about today is energy efficiency, specifically what Efficiency Canada is advocating for in Budget 2022. Energy efficiency is a huge world. There's a lot of different ways to go at it, a lot of different ways to work on it, but we've identified what we think are 3 key opportunities, areas that we can make change in 2022. There's a political opportunity, the policy window is open, the funding is there, and if these policies were enacted, it would make a pretty significant difference in our path forward to net zero. So I'm going to tell you all about those policies, but break it down into 3 chunks. So I'm going to talk about who we are, a little bit about Efficiency Canada, who are we, if you haven't heard of us, I want to make sure you know who we are and what we do, dive into those policies, give you some background, dive into the meat of those. And then a key piece that I like to focus on is how are we actually making it happen? What are we as Efficiency Canada doing? How can you be involved if something jumps out and you really want to take action on it? So who are we? Who is Efficiency Canada? Who is this person talking to you? Efficiency Canada is the national voice for an energy efficient economy. We envision a future where Canada uses energy efficiency to its fullest potential. This means maximizing the benefits for a sustainable environment, a productive economy, and a just and equitable society. What does that really mean? So because we are the national voice for an energy efficient economy, we work from coast to coast to coast. So we don't focus on one particular region. And we also tend to focus at the federal level. So a lot of the policies that I'm talking about are for the federal budget. Doesn't mean that we don't work at the provincial and municipal level, but our focus tends to be federal. We envision a future where Canada uses energy efficiency to its fullest potential, and that fullest potential means we're getting the benefits of it. So there's a lot of benefits to be had from energy efficiency, and specifically, we can have a sustainable environment, so we can reduce our emissions by reducing our energy use, a productive economy, so we can create the things that we need, the homes we want to live in, the vehicles we use to get to and from the places we're trying to go, while reducing our impact. And it needs to be just and equitable. So we don't want those impacts to just go to a few people. We want those benefits to be for everybody. Efficiency Canada is housed at Carleton University, but we're located the university is located, and I'm currently located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. I think it's important when we do land acknowledgements to also reflect on what that really means, and specifically with energy efficiency. As we go through this presentation, keep it centered that our energy systems are still colonial in nature, and that impacts, the work that we do on all fronts. So I think it's important to center that as we continue through the conversation. What are the areas that we actually work on? So like I said, energy efficiency is a huge conversation. At Efficiency Canada, we specifically focus on decarbonizing our buildings, net zero productive economy. So like I said, producing goods and services more efficiently, and meaningful careers. So there's a lot of jobs that are created when we focus on energy efficiency. And when we're looking to transition away from some of our more harmful sectors of work, energy efficiency is a great landing place. It's meaningful work. It's making our homes comfortable and safe and healthy. And we want people to recognize that there are these great jobs out there that they can, really contribute to their community in a meaningful way and reduce carbon emissions and help the environment. How do we actually do that as Efficiency Canada? We'd like to break our work into we don't call it departments, we call it the three-headed beast. And when the three-headed beast rears its head, we tend to get a lot done. So those three pieces are research. We like to ground our policies on really good data. We communicate, so we tell stories about the things that we hear. We want to make it engaging. We want people to be as excited about energy efficiency as they are about renewables, for example, or about electric vehicles, which have this great community around them. We want this for energy efficiency. And the last piece is engagement. So we want people not just to hear about it, but to be excited to go out and take action and be part of the work that we're doing. So what does that look like in 2022? What are the big opportunities? There's three pieces that we are focusing on. The first is a low-income energy efficiency program. The second is net zero building code acceleration. And the third is preparing for retrofit scale up. So depending on how familiar you are with energy efficiency, this might sound like a lot of words put together that don't mean much of anything, or it might sound really exciting, but I'll make sure that by the end, it sounds really exciting to everybody. So on the side of low income energy efficiency, 20% of Canadian households experience energy poverty, and they're pretty unlikely to participate in the programs that exist right now. So that means 1 in 5 Canadian households experiencing energy poverty. What that means is a household spends more than double the national median as a percentage of their income on energy costs. So the national average is 3%. If you're spending 6% or more of your household income on energy costs, you're in energy poverty. A specific aspect of poverty that can make it really difficult to, sometimes people have to choose between heating their homes and having food in the fridge. And that's not a choice that anybody should have to make. The programs that exist right now, they expect people to pay upfront for things, and they also expect people to be able to still fund a significant portion of a retrofit themselves. So they would get a $5,000 grant, but if the total cost is $25,000, that doesn't help you very much unless you have a lot of money already lying around. And so we want to shift the federal priorities to at least equally value a low-income program. So the best practices in low-income programming are that they provide turnkey retrofits at no cost. If you're struggling to make ends meet, you don't have the time to chase down contractors to analyze your home, do an audit, figure out what pieces, pull all these things together, apply for all of the different grants. You need to make it as simple as possible. So you make it no cost to the homeowner, and the work is organized for them. So someone can walk in, walk them through the whole process, and it happens very easily. There are provincial programs that exist in almost every province across Canada, but a lot of these programs are focused on really shallow retrofits, and their driving idea is that all of the upgrades done need to be cost effective. So if I were to swap out some light bulbs in my home, that might get paid back in a year or two. If I were to install a heat pump, it might take 10 or 15 years. And so from the perspective of a provincial utility, the heat pump doesn't sound that appealing, which means that they tend to focus on really shallow measures that don't make nearly as much of an impact. And so we want the federal government to provide funding to provincial programs, encouraging them to move towards best practices. So that's turnkey deep retrofits focusing on fuel switching that come at no cost to low-income participants. And we're asking for $2 billion. Sounds like a lot, but that amount would only really start to retrofit 2 to 3% of households in energy poverty per year. So it's a small step, but one that we need to start to take. Item number 2 is really fun because it's actually one that we're making some good progress on. And I find in a lot of our climate conversations, it can be a lot of bad news. And of course, there is a lot of bad news out there, but I'm going to give you guys one piece tonight that there's some great things happening. So in terms of building codes, the reason these are really important to our climate action is because new homes are being built every single day all across Canada, and these homes are using energy at a really significant rate. But the federal government proposed in 2022, they were supposed to release a net zero energy ready building code. And what this would mean is that every single home built would be energy efficient enough that on-site renewables would be enough to power the house. It was a tiered code, so you would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps. Every few years, you move up one step at a time, heading towards net zero. And what this does for builders is it lets them know that, okay, 10 years down the road, we're going there. So the market has to respond. It has to start to prepare for that. So, you know, sometimes kicking and screaming, the market gets pulled along towards this goal that we're all heading towards. So the 2020 codes have been delayed, but the good news is they're supposed to come out in early 2022. So we're going to see those landing very shortly. A good, effective climate plan for Canada, the PCF, called for a model retrofit code by 2022. So this would be not for new homes, but retrofitting existing homes. They were then delayed until 2030. Another piece of good news in the mandate letters, they should, in an ideal world, be released by 2024. So that delay has been significantly shortened. The 2020 model codes don't actually consider emissions, which is, it's an interesting particularity. They focus on energy use, but the mandate letters call for a net zero emissions building code by 2024. So another step where the federal government is recognizing just how important this is to meeting our climate goals. And another piece, there's 2 ministers who are now responsible for codes, and the mandate letters also recognize that the provinces are going to need some support to adopt those model codes. So the federal government releases it, the provinces choose to adopt it or not. The federal government recognizes that to get the provinces to take such a significant step, they're going to need some support. It should help quite a bit with getting that adoption to happen quickly across the country. Our climate goals require moving away from let's build the worst house that we can legally build, which, builders don't love to hear, but that's what the code is. It's the worst house that you're legally allowed to build. And moving towards, this is our endpoint, net zero emissions, we're going to get there. So let's start to work towards it, transform the markets and make it happen. And we are starting to see that political will at the federal level. And the piece that we're really asking for in the budget is that funding to support provinces along the way. I'm going to take everyone take a stretch if you need. It's a lot of me talking at you, but I'm going to keep going through. We've got our last piece here, which is the Retrofit Mission. So we released a report in June of 2021. This report is outlining why are retrofits moving so slowly? We recognize that this is such an important piece for us to meet our climate goals. It has so many benefits for our homes. It makes them healthier and more comfortable and more resilient. But at the pace we're moving, it's going to take 142 years to retrofit all the homes in Canada. And that's, I don't need to tell everyone on this call that that's way too slow. So we've started to break down what are the barriers, how can we address them? So what we have to realize is that the current performance of building retrofits has a lot more to do with our policy and market structures than any actual physical limitations. So in particular, our way of doing things both in governments and in markets holds back some of the key benefits that could speed up retrofits, like economies of scale, learning, and dynamic efficiencies. The dominant policy environment for energy efficiency tends to evaluate building retrofits in a really static way, using a cost-benefit analysis that really underestimates the benefits. So the benefits will be mostly cost-based rather than looking at social, health, equity impacts. They also tend to focus on really short-term results. So like I was talking about with that payback period, they're going to want that payback to be, a few years, not 10, 20, or 30. The market itself is also really challenging. Every single house is a little bit different. So you're not doing one project and then doing it 1,000 times. You have to go house to house and individually figure out how to make that work. The owner is going to have to work with you through that project, and each owner then has to navigate this market. And the supply chains are pretty segmented. And so under these constraints, it's really difficult to speed up that retrofit process. But we have some ideas on how we can make that move much more quickly. The first piece is market development teams, and we want to see these teams all throughout Canada. The idea is that this team brings together all three sides of the retrofit mission. So our policymakers, our construction and manufacturing side, and the building owners. And they're trying to identify replicable solutions. So every project is different, but at its base, there are some commonalities. And how can we address those commonalities? So for example, things like financing, some of the products that have to go into each home, these are replicable. And if we can find ways to make them more efficient, more accessible, we can speed things up. Another really inspiring example is Energy Sprong, which comes from the Netherlands. And when translated, it is called the Energy Leap. So what this does is they've aggregated together affordable housing so that they can produce economies of scale. And then they take this aggregated demand. So they're going to builders and HVAC companies with hundreds of units or thousands of units behind them. And that gives them a lot of room to negotiate. So they've come up with new technologies, they get better prices. They're using things like prefabricated wall assemblies and all-in-one HVAC systems. So instead of taking months, they can retrofit houses in a matter of weeks, and they can do net zero energy ready retrofits without displacing the folks living inside the homes. So it's pretty spectacular. And this idea did make its way into the Liberal Party platform. So again, another hint that the federal government is paying attention to this. They know that it's important, and they're taking note of some things happening around the world. So another piece of hopeful and good news. So then this last piece is, this all sounds really great, and I'm sure everyone on this call agrees with me, but how do we make it happen for the policymakers? So I'm just going to give, a little sample of what Efficiency Canada is doing and how we're approaching these things. There's a lot more, but this is more about all of us on the call and not just an Efficiency Canada lecture. So what we are doing is soon we're going to be launching a campaign specifically focused on this low income piece. And energy poverty is also going to define a big part of our research agenda this year. So we'll be having more data coming out, and we're going to really be driving this home to the federal government before the budget. If you want to be involved, if this inspires you, when we launch our sign-on letter, which should hopefully be next week, spread the word and add your name. Really, like every single name that gets on there, it gives it a little bit more weight, just a little bit more emphasis when it gets to the minister's hands. So every single name is a big, big help there. And I don't have the link just yet because the campaign hasn't launched, but I'll see if Nick might be able to circulate that when it does. And then on our net zero building code piece, so a lot of what we're doing here is building. We're generating support, growing our networks, getting people excited about it. So the mandate letter signaled a big federal policy shift. We have a group of volunteers called our Action on Building Code Council, and actually one of the members is in the call today, which is pretty awesome. And so they're going to be working with us to convene and build support throughout 2022 around provincial code adoption. How can you help? I can share a link for this one. You can get to know your ABC Council member. So they're the person in your province who's going to be working closely with us to lead actions across the country. We're also hoping to have some kind of workshop in April or May, specifically focused on how to advocate around the building code. So this is really, really big opportunity to have a pretty significant impact on emissions over the next few years, and it needs to happen in every single province across Canada. And the last piece is preparing for the retrofit scale up. So we're doing a lot of this advocacy internally with the federal government, but externally we have another volunteer group called the Regional Champions, and they continue to work and build awareness around the importance of energy efficiency so that community is there to demonstrate to the federal government that there's political will behind this idea. So how can you help? The retrofit mission is a bit complicated. So we've got a report out. You can read the whole report if you're a policy wonk and that's your thing, but we also have a 2-page summary, and it's a great way to understand the landscape a little bit more and be able to talk about these challenges and get that conversation starting. And you can also tweet that report to the ministers, and every single tweet just nudges them a little bit more to pay attention, to take note of this, and to be involved. And so that's what I've got for you today. Here's the big mission: is our efficient and decarbonized buildings. That's what we want for Canada. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Kirstin. Yeah, a lot of great work going on. I think you've been able to hit on, a bunch of the different things that we're definitely seeing need that sort of push and that advancement out there. Invite everyone to share any questions into chat now, and we'll get those over to Kirstin. I did have one question from Lucianne, and she's actually one of your first to sign on to the letter. So we've got the first there. She's wondering, Retrofit Code, is it a forced renovation or subsidy to improve current housing?
So the Retrofit Code is a good question because it's a little bit complicated. They don't quite have it figured out exactly how it would work yet, but it would be, they'd have to figure out at what level of renovation does the Retrofit Code kick in. So let's say you're doing 60% of your home will be changed by the renovation that you're doing. At that point, your renovation would have to meet a certain list of code requirements, and one of those might be increased energy efficiency. So there's a lot of nuance to figure out, right? It gets a little bit complicated. Does that deter people from renovating their homes? Does it make it harder to do, if you're struggling to make ends meet and you need to expand your home and now suddenly you have to renovate the entire building to meet these standards? So it's complicated, which is why they are taking their time to come up with it. But the great thing then is that major renovations would need to increase their energy efficiency, need to start down that path towards meeting our climate goals. So it's a complicated piece, but an important one. Oh, Nick, you muted yourself. Oh, Nick, you muted yourself there.
Oh, whoops, sorry about that. So Rar, if you don't mind typing your question into chat, that would be great if you have the capacity to do that, and then we'll get that over to Kirstin. I had a couple of questions for you. How is it going to work with choosing the low-income properties to use the $2 billion with? Is that going to be something that's going to be like an application process, a grant program? What's the vision of that?
Yeah, so there's two pieces you can look at. One's in Canada and one's in the UK. So in Canada, Nova Scotia has a program called home warming. And the way that works is if you want to do a retrofit in your home and you're looking for grants, you apply through one portal and they'll push you to the correct program that you should be in. So any Canadian could apply through one entranceway. And if they are above a certain income level, they go to greener homes. Other levels, they would go into this low income program. And it's a one-stop shop. Another example to look at that we're really excited about is from the United Kingdom, and what they're developing is an energy poverty strategy. So not just putting out funding, but really analyzing what are the homes that are in the greatest need? What are the least efficient homes and the lowest income folks that need the most support? And then they start with those homes and work up. So rather than just waiting for people to apply, they're actually, starting with those who need it most. And that includes all the different aspects that intersect with poverty and with inability to access renovations. So that's what we're pushing for, is a more in-depth strategy to addressing energy poverty. But a big piece of that is the funding. And I think there's great examples that we can look to.
Great. I've got another question here from Andrea. She's wondering, how will retrofits impact renters and rental costs? Any rent control assurances? It's a good question for those that are out there renting, right?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question right now. Is I think a lot of people are aware of how retrofits can make tenants' rights even more precarious, and they're already precarious for a lot of people. So that's one of the things that is, we're looking at that as a research topic for this year, because honestly, I think a lot of people are still grappling with that of how do we include that in a retrofit strategy, and what are the policies that can make tenants more secure while also giving them better quality housing that's also affordable. There's a lot of pieces to work together on that. So I would say in Boulder, Colorado, there's a lot of great work being done on that and looking into that and trying out new policies and things, but mostly we don't really quite have the answer yet, but we're looking for it.
Absolutely, and that's part of the solution, right? Pamela is wondering, how is Efficiency Canada focusing on embodied energy for net zero and retrofits, trying to avoid carbon in the build stage rather than just focusing on energy efficiency for the operating phase of the building? Great question there, Pamela.
Yeah, for sure. That's the other $1 million. There's a few $1 million questions in energy efficiency, and you folks are hitting on all of them. I think that there is some talk of embodied carbon being included in future versions of the building code and possibly the retrofit code, because there are cases where doing the retrofit, the materials used actually offsets any of the energy savings that you're going to get from having undertaken the retrofit. So it's definitely a piece that I would say has only really started getting attention in the last few years, but I think we'll see it in future iterations of codes being addressed more thoroughly.
Great. Rar had a question. How is this process incorporating Indigenous concerns, challenges, and rights? Is that something you folks have looked at?
Yeah, so an organization that we really support and work closely with is Indigenous Clean Energy. And they actually came out with a great report just in 2021 that looked at I think it's all Indigenous communities. What would the cost be to retrofit and improve the quality of housing for all Indigenous Canadians across Canada? And they analyzed, what are the costs? How do we get it done? Who's going to need to, how many workers do we need? Like, they really broke it down. It's expensive. Yeah, it's definitely quite a bit of money. So there are great people leading that research, and we've had them on our platform to talk through that report. And it's also a big piece. It's interesting in the low income energy efficiency conversation, because I would say it's interesting in that there's some overlap, right? It's not necessarily you need us, and all energy efficiency strategies need to be aware that there are complexities with Indigenous communities, and it's not a one size fits all solution, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so when you come up with any strategy around retrofits or around energy poverty or around building codes as well, there's a lot of different stakeholders that need to be considered. So it's kind of an airy-fairy answer, but I can talk to you a bit more about some of the research that we're reading and how we're incorporating that in our work.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much. John's wondering, how are you proposing to ensure the technical skills for retrofits, boots on the ground, are available? We're seeing a lot around skills and whether there's workers available. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks for that question, because now I get to plug like one of the most exciting things we're working on right now, which is called our Discovery Hub. And it's discovery with 2 E's, so discover energy efficiency. And it's a one-stop shop to draw people into energy efficiency careers. So we're going to have, there's training resources on there. There's people on there who are in each career that people can connect with. We're going to be offering incentives for different training options. There's career talks. We're doing all kinds of things to pull people into the energy efficiency sector. It's an interesting area because it's not that there's a lack of jobs. It's actually that there's often a lack of skilled people who are able to do those jobs. And so trying to pull people into the sector, get them trained up, make those opportunities available, that's a big focus of our work. And I think if anyone has some time, even while we're on the call, and wants to check out the Discover EE Hub, it's a lot of fun. It's a really cool and like vibrant and alive space to check out.
Great. Yeah, maybe share a link. I also wanted to just put a plug in for some work I'm doing with the Ottawa Energy Collective. So if we do have any folks that are in the retrofit sector on the call, we're looking for folks that are working in that sector to fill out a critically important survey. And I have just put that link into chat there, so folks can take a look at that and fill that out. What skill? Okay, so there's a lot of folks that are kind of wondering about what skills. I would say folks who have that sort of renewable, full building sort of science knowledge. Any particular skills that you could sort of hit on there, Kirstin?
Yeah. So to give one particular example, for a net zero home, you really need the building envelope to be really airtight. There can't be any gaps. It has to be really seamless. There can't be anything. Thermal bridging is a big problem. So something touches outside air and then also, comes inside the home and transfers cold or heat inside your home. And so doing that really precise, really finely detailed work isn't something that's taught in all trade programs. And so trying to upskill workers so that they learn not just how to do insulation, but how to do net zero insulation, it's different. And so we need to be training, all tradespeople. We need energy managers and architects and all of these folks who already work on building homes to now get upskilled to learn the extra step required to build a net zero home. So it's a little bit of everything needed from a little bit of everybody. And it's a big project, but there's a lot of people thinking about it.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to mention John's question. He was having difficulty finding a company to do domestic air sealing. I'm not sure that's something we can answer on this call today, John, but invite you to join us on February 17th, where we talk about in depth about home retrofits. We've got someone from Aero Barrier joining us on that one to talk about insulation. So I'll share another link into chat. You can sign up now for that session. So Kirstin, let me get you out on here on one last question. I just wanted you to touch a little bit on the community champions again. Is that something that's open for people to apply to, or if someone wanted to become a community champion, what would the process be?
We actually just closed our applications for the regional champions, but for Action on Building Code Council, a few of our provinces are filled up, but we have 2 folks per province are invited to join that. And there's some areas, so I think Alberta, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, a few others. I'll share the link in the chat. I've got a bunch of links I'll be sharing shortly. We're looking for folks in those regions who want to get involved, but always we're happy to have people reach out. If you send me a message and say you want to get involved, I'll find somewhere for you to get involved. So we'd be happy to have anybody who wants to make change.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Kirstin. Really appreciate it. Fabulous to hear about some of the work that you're up to. I think there's some great initiatives there. I know you've got, we'll give you a chance to take a little bit of a breath, grab a drink, and I know you've got a lot of links that you're going to be putting into chat there, so people can stay tuned for that. Someone's asking for your email too, so I don't know if you feel comfortable or just somewhere where folks can maybe contact you. But yeah, thanks so much for that. It was a great presentation, great way to start us off, and some great stuff to think about. So now we're going to pivot to the other side of the country, and I think it's a great segue over to our next speaker, who's been working on the West Coast quite a bit around these issues. And we're going to welcome in Evan Pivnik, who is a senior policy advisor with Clean Energy Canada, where he works to bring climate action and innovation together to build stronger economies. Before joining Clean Energy Canada, Evan served as the chief of staff for the BC Green Caucus during the 2017 to 2020 minority government. He was deeply involved in the creation of Clean BC, British Columbia's climate strategy. Evan holds an undergraduate degree in political science with a minor in human dimensions of climate change. Quite a minor, I like that. He holds a certificate in leadership, organizing, and action, leading change from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government Executive Program. So thanks so much for joining us all the way from BC. Come on in, Evan. You should be able to unmute yourself and share your screen. Thanks for being here. Oh, he's busy in chat there. There we go.
There we go. Yeah, it just wasn't letting me unmute there. Great to meet everyone. Yeah, the minor was mainly an excuse to get to take courses in whatever faculty I wanted. So ended up being very useful there. Just going to share my screen here. So what I am going to be talking a little bit about today is BC's Climate Plan, where it's come from, where it's gone, and I think some of the lessons it has for other provinces, Canada in general. I think it's there's sort of this truth to the fact that I think BC, along with Quebec, is really the provinces at the leading edge of Canada when it comes to climate action. At the same time, I think in the province, at least, that leads to some complacency around where we're perhaps not leaders, some of which I'll talk about today. But I'm hoping this is going to be useful and interesting for work everyone does in their own communities. So Clean BC, for those who don't know and maybe have seen the logo or the branding, Clean BC is BC's Climate Plan. It first came out in the fall of 2018. In that plan, which came out under a minority government, it laid out a path to achieve 75% of the target to 2030. Remaining, so 25% of emissions were unknown. We didn't know where it was going to come from. We didn't know how we were going to reach that goal. The government had committed to finalize the plan for a variety of reasons, some of which you can imagine things got a little bit delayed. But in 2021, they came out with the roadmap to 2030. And this was the comprehensive plan that showed a pathway for how BC can actually achieve its 2030 target. So that included the policies, the policy areas. In BC, we have sectoral targets, which has allowed us to do planning at a buildings, transportation, and industry level. So this is BC's emissions pathway over time. So although we can talk about being the farthest ahead in, or perhaps with Quebec, farther ahead on having a plan in place, you can see from the emissions over time that we by no means have shown a reduction in emissions. Now, not increasing emissions during this time is in and of itself an important success. And if you look at per capita emissions, BC has certainly gone down. And this graphic on the right here really shows how emissions have gone down, but also, I think, interestingly, the period in which the carbon tax was actually frozen, you saw a little bit of a period immediately afterwards where per capita emissions started to increase. GHG emissions per person are a little bit, you can't lean on them too heavily, but I think this presents an important picture around policies that are working and the impacts of following through on some of those pieces. So getting into what BC is. So this plan that was released last fall really puts BC as one of the most ambitious jurisdictions in North America. There's significant leadership in buildings and in transportation sectors, which together represent 50% of BC's 2019 emissions. And there's not really any major reliance on on offsets. I think in a lot of climate plans, there can sort of be this wedge that's always included for offsets or for innovation. And really this plan doesn't put that as a major piece here. Its biggest weakness is in urgency. So there's a lot of plans, there's a lot of pieces that need to roll out. And certainly for the oil and gas sector, the commitment is more vague. The timelines are a little bit delayed. This sector really does matter. The urgency with which we act on these areas really is going to matter quite a bit. And I think that's definitely the greatest critique of the plan of where it stands. And I think the gap where we still have work to do is BC's climate plan still hasn't quite bridged over to becoming its economic plan. I think Quebec has really done probably the best job in Canada in integrating where it sees prosperity and economic opportunity for the province along that low carbon pathway. BC's still talks on sort of both sides on that. And I think that's the biggest gap in this plan. This is the overview of where we're at, what BC's plan looks like, the wedges as we've used them. This is what having sectoral targets can look like and how it can really be a really useful planning tool in thinking about the policies. So since 1990, BC emissions have risen about 22%, going from 56.2 megatons to 68.3. Since 2007, they've risen 5%, and emissions are up just less than 1% from 2018 to 2019. We've got targets 40% below 2007 levels by 2030, 60% by 2040, 80% by 2050. We also have a 2025 interim target for a 16% reduction. You can see on this graph, this is, I think, a really important message, and I don't want to shy away from the importance of the oil and gas sector, but you can see in BC's overall emissions, if our goal is to put a climate plan in place that can track our economy to become a net zero economy, it isn't just about oil and gas. In fact, that's one wedge of the much larger piece, and it's why when there's such significant leadership in transportation and buildings, it is really important, I think, to acknowledge those areas as a much bigger share of where emissions are coming from. So getting into some of the specifics on carbon pricing, BC really is first jurisdiction, I believe, globally or among the first globally to put a price on carbon. From the very start, as the feds have sort of advanced their piece, BC's been committed to aligning with that $170 per ton by 2030. BC's been vocal in its support of that. I think it has, because we've all sort of moved to carbon tax being a real thing now, it can be easy to forget how not that long ago, having a carbon tax at all was one of the biggest political sort of fights that were taking place, we're now talking about $170 a ton in 8 years' time. And that is just an absolute leap from where we were. Looking at transportation, BC was the first jurisdiction to globally legislate a 100% zero emission vehicle standard. What we've found is we got started, there was targets put in place, and we've blown past those. So we're actually, the main piece here isn't a bunch of new policy in transportation, at least for passenger vehicles. It's just accelerating the targets and the policies that were already put in place. In 2020, almost 10% of the new car sales in BC were electric. We met our 2025 target 5 years ahead of time. So in 2020, we'd actually reached where we initially thought we'd be in 2025, which I will come back to in the end, but just to hype it here as well, really does show the importance of not letting getting the perfect target in place be a barrier to getting something in place, get going and beat it and show that you can beat it, and then increase the ambition. The new roadmap tripled the old 2030 target. It's now at 90% en route to 100% by 2035. And the 2030 target is actually the most ambitious target for anywhere in North America. On medium and heavy duty vehicles, most jurisdictions are just now really starting to understand both how many emissions are coming from that, but also the critical need to put some policies in place in this area. BC's committed to match California's sale target of 100% by 2045 where feasible. California is really by far the global leader when it comes to putting together a plan of action and a suite of policies for how we're actually going to be able to move trucking, last mile delivery, drayage, garbage trucks, how those are actually going to get from where we are now to seeing electric or zero emission vehicles deployed. Looking at buildings, BC became the first province in Canada to use the building code to establish a carbon pollution standard for buildings. It established a net zero standard by 2030 for new buildings, and new equipment sold for space and water heating must be electric heaters or heat pumps by 2030. So I think with the last presentation, a lot of overlap here. BC is really, I think, at the cutting edge of moving some of these pieces forward. Devil's in the details, and I think there's a lot more work to do when it comes to the existing buildings, but moving forward those standards on new buildings really will make a huge difference. The BC Building Code is also going to include new energy efficiency requirements for existing buildings by 2024. That's where a lot of the new, which technologies can be deployed and how they're deployed. When it comes to electricity, we've got a 100% clean electricity standard by 2030. It's the strongest of its kind in North America. It really is a novel piece of policy. It is a little bit cheating for BC to hype this too much. We've got incredible hydro resources that have been long developed. So the 100% clean standard by 2030 is, I think, really important. It will set a lot of policy direction, but it's also perhaps an area where BC has the easiest pathway. And I think a lot of other provinces have a much more difficult time ahead planning their energy mix, where it's really going to come from as these policies come out here. When it comes to industry, we've got an established, the gas utility here has actually had a GHG cap placed on it. It's the only commitment of its kind to really cap the emissions coming from the natural gas sector. We've also got all new industry plants are going to be required to present plans for how they'll align with net zero targets. Now, that's only applying to new facilities, which is a knock against this. There's plenty of existing facilities that we really need to move along. And that, I think, remains a bit of a gap in the industry space. When it comes to the oil and gas sector, there's been a lot more and some clear language around policy or regulation to enforce a sectoral target here, similar to the federal commitment to really cap emissions. I think the details and the timeline of this is really where anyone working in this space is rightfully focusing. Saying these words is a lot easier than following through on this, but the commitment to use policy or regulation really does add some teeth to this commitment. So looking to see that followed through on, which I think, that does make a considerable difference there. That's the good. That's largely the things that I think BC can rightfully stand up and feel quite proud of. I think, as I mentioned in the beginning, the other side of this that perhaps still needs some work is urgency. There's a lot of strategies, notably in the industry and oil and gas sector, where a lot of the work's been left to do. The commitment has been to create a plan. It's not the details of the plan yet. Achieving a lot of this, and not just getting to 2030, but setting ourselves up for the 2040 and 2050 targets means integrating the way we think about economic planning with our climate planning. So if we're serious about reaching these targets, we can't really be expanding the role of natural gas in BC, which is one of, it's a rapidly expanding industry at this point in time. So there is some consistency issues that I think there. On the energy side, I think, and this is true right across Canada, the question of supply is going to become a greater and greater challenge that we're going to need to wrestle with. BC's done a great job of putting all sorts of demand policies in place, whether it's MHDV, personal vehicles, buildings, industry. Getting things over to electric is great. In Canada, we've got really long-term windows for how long it takes to get infrastructure up, and we don't really have a clear pathway for how we're going to put enough electricity in place to meet those targets. And this, I think, is one of the most significant areas where Indigenous engagement and Indigenous concerns are really front and center. There just has not been sufficient funding or processes to engage First Nations in BC, where we've got, by far the most nations on unceded territory. And their role, I'm not just viewing it as how do we find partnerships, but how do we build new models that really advance reconciliation? These could be Indigenous utilities, these could be, fully owned, and this is likely the direction it will have to go, is fully owned Indigenous clean energy projects that are supplying a lot of the new electrons we need to power a lot of the climate solutions here in BC. That conversation is happening too slowly, especially for the speed in which we're going to need that power to be coming online. And I think that there's going to be some tough conversations around that to come. So this is BC in a snapshot. A lot of details, a lot of numbers thrown at it. Happy to talk about any of the details. I think the key pieces and the lessons out of BC aren't necessarily at a policy level, though. I think there's any number of different policies that jurisdictions can and should try to emulate. But I think there's actually broader lessons for Canada and for provinces that, Ontario is going to be going to an election, Alberta is going to be going to an election, and where we will see climate policy actually move forward for us to have sometimes a bit more difficult conversations. So first off is not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think this is, even in the release of this new roadmap, there was a lot of criticism from environmental organizations rightfully pointing out the gaps in oil and gas. And I think I would certainly agree that nothing is quick enough. There's not enough. We need more. We need it faster. But if all we showcase is where things are not enough, and all we do is point out all the problems with things, we're not actually showing Canadians what good policy looks like. And we're not going to give governments much reason to actually demonstrate that leadership. So I think it is important to get things on paper and get things moving. Likewise, and it's the other piece of what I talked about is on the passenger vehicle regs. We put a zero emission vehicle target in place and then smashed the record, absolutely blew it out of the water, so that a couple years later, we're now the most ambitious jurisdiction in North America when it comes to our target. There's reason to get something in place, let things get started, and then build off something. I think really keeping an eye not on what would be the ideal, but what moves us in the right direction. Second piece, and I've touched on this quite a bit, is climate policy needing to become more integrated with economic policy. I've highlighted energy, but I would also talk about affordability. I think interestingly, and Kirstin can speak far more eloquently about this, the nexus of building policy and affordability, I think, is this really challenging question. We need to retrofit buildings, existing buildings and new buildings everywhere at a time when a lot of communities face affordability crises for getting into the housing market. How we square that is going to come down to some really smart policy. and taking a look at our objectives here. And I don't think there's easy solutions to that, but unless we start to think about economic policy and climate policy simultaneously, we're really just going to have them play off against each other. And the worst place we could be is having Canadians backing away from climate policy because of affordability concerns. I think that would be a big fail on the part of those of us working in climate policy. Third point I'd say, and I don't know how many people have heard of climate change as a collective action problem. I increasingly think of it, especially in Canada, as a distributed impacts problem. The challenge we face isn't sort of freeloaders and early movers not getting the advantages of moving first. It's that we've got different communities across this country that are going to be winners and losers, whether we transition or not. So if we could rapidly move away and move towards net zero, Alberta is really going to face incredible challenges. All sorts of communities across northern BC are going to face incredible challenges. Unless we bring people along in this, it is going to be a political fight every step of the way. And the urgency required means we just won't be able to get there. If we can start to think of this as not who's with us and who's against us, but instead understanding that the policies, even good climate policy, will create losers in different communities, and then design our policies to bring those groups along, those communities along, provide opportunities, provide pathways. That's going to be far more effective. It's where sort of just transition and worker-centric policies and industries that we want to move away from are just so essential. And the last piece I'd say is really leadership matters. We've had both climate leadership in BC under a BC Liberal government and under a minority government between the BC NDP and the BC Greens. This isn't a partisan comment. It's that the individuals and the people at the table, at political tables, those decision makers really do have an outsized impact on what is possible. And the people we elect and the people we boost, both, within the public service, but also obviously those we more directly elect, has an outsized impact on what ultimately we're able to accomplish. So leave this slide up for a little bit, for just a moment. Nick, happy to take any questions around any of this that have come up.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Evan. Some great lessons and some great knowledge sharing from out in the West Coast there. Someone was asking for your emails, so that's great. Definitely leave that slide up for a little bit. Invite everybody to share their questions into chat. I do have a few to go through. Andres was wondering, are there plans in BC for generating a green hydrogen ecosystem?
Yeah, so hydrogen is one of the areas that I think from the BC government perspective, they are incredibly bullish on its potential. I think there's good reasons to think that both BC and Alberta, that's a good spot for that technology focus. I would say it also hasn't been widely proven just yet. It almost certainly is going to have a role, and I think as we move forward, hydrogen is proving itself, long distance trucking, certainly in helping actually boost some renewable deployment in certain, very energy intensive industrial processes. Hydrogen is probably actually going to take a greater space than electricity. But that technology has a little ways to go. We've got a roadmap in place. I think the federal roadmap is a bit more sophisticated. I'm doing a bit more of a wait and see where things ultimately land on that before getting really excited. So short answer is yes, but I think details TBD.
Okay, great. Victoria is wondering, what kind of enforcement mechanisms are planned or in place? Is it a little bit more the stick or the carrot? I think it seems like it's a bit more the carrot out in BC, but any enforcement mechanisms that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, I'd say there's a mixture of both and different at different levels. So when we talk about political, sort of very, starting at the most macro, we actually have accountability legislation in BC. There's annual reporting, there's requirements to provide details, there's, getting into the actual, what we were able to accomplish. That provides a public lens that moves, I think, us at least a little bit beyond the rhetoric, that requirement to report. When it gets to the individual policies, there's all sorts of sticks embodied throughout them. When we talk about the new medium and heavy duty vehicle policies and aligning with California, that's actually setting a sales mandate. that means that manufacturers will have to put a certain number of vehicles on the road or face financial penalties. That's the design of the program. Similarly, when we talk the building code, bringing up the regs, that's a minimum standard for things to be built, period. But then, Nick, you're absolutely right. The incentive side and making this the cost-effective option, helping accelerate the market where the market would want to move more slowly, has been an incredibly important tool. And certainly with electric vehicles and passenger electric vehicles, for instance, that's been far more carrot than stick.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice to see all those rebates and incentives. Maybe we'll get some out of those out here in Ontario at some point. John's wondering, how comfortable are you with climate policy in BC in 2022 when the emissions database is from 2019? Imagine if economic policy was based on 2019 data, he says. So that's an interesting question.
I couldn't agree more. The BC inventory has a 2-year delay, in part because that's what the federal, we base our numbers off of the federal inventory and data collection there. I think I both agree that it's unfortunate from a planning, and when you compare it to how quickly the economy's moving, it seems ludicrous how behind that is. There's a lot of people and a lot of data collection, and it's really complicated to get accurate numbers. I think what I'd say is it's why there's a role for targets, but why we shouldn't become obsessed with chasing targets and constantly increasing targets rather than getting the policies in place that change the economy. I'm actually far more, at BC now, I'm not all that interested in the targets. I'm interested in seeing the actual changes in the sector. I'm interested in the the medium and heavy duty vehicle deployment targets and the zero emission vehicle adoption targets. Those are far more substantial and will allow for the long-term emissions reductions we need versus constantly tweaking or sort of that backward looking emissions calculations. So it has its role, but I think in BC at least, its role is more on accountability than anything else.
Absolutely. Art's wondering, what is the energy policy on small modular reactors? Is that something you could speak to?
I can generally, I think there's certainly no position on it in terms of BC. I don't really think there'd be much utility of it there. I think it's a conversation that Canada and different economies around the world are going to have around the role that small modular reactors, nuclear reactors is the question here, are going to play. There's certainly interest in Alberta, in certain areas, perhaps in Ontario. It's very different technology, and it would be a high energy source that could provide, the power to meet all of the energy demand. But it's not I don't think it's a quick and dirty sort of yes, no question here. And I would be very interested in others, a bit more background on some of the cons from it.
Absolutely. Mark had a great question. Are there plans to take the Vancouver ban on natural gas hookups province-wide? So it's great to see that ban in Vancouver. Is that something you see going province-wide?
Yeah, Mark, really good question. I don't expect it will move quickly province-wide. I think there are equity considerations for smaller communities where there just really isn't an alternative or at the very least a reliable alternative to that. I'm with you. I think that, the idea that we are still hooking up natural gas houses and new builds, there's no reason why Lower Mainland or Victoria, Southern Vancouver Island couldn't put those in place. I think I'd look more regional, and I think I'd focus on that being a municipal-led piece and see how much traction we could get through that first and foremost. You'd also see, by far the greatest return on investment. But again, would be interested in others who've done more deep work on that specific issue.
Yeah, it's nice to see a bunch of the municipalities, a lot of places in California starting to do the same thing. So interesting. Alex wondering, how are you using communication tools to nudge BCers to take action? And that's something, we're focused on here is kind of the education communication piece. Is that something you could speak to a little bit?
Yeah, so on two different levels. I think the BC government has tried to do a lot more on communications than they've done in previous iterations. They've tried to ground this plan within people. And the sort of where people would interface with the plan. I do think the lack of 100% connection to the economic planning hinders that a little bit. From a Clean Energy Canada perspective, on the communication side, our focus really is on solutions. Our focus is on how far we've come. You know, in the intro, it said, you know, I was working with the BC Greens when this started. I first got in when Andrew Weaver first ran in 2013, and BC was talking about LNG strategy and that we were going to lead the world in LNG deployment. We had frozen the carbon tax and there was no carbon or no climate plan in place. As of 2018, so within 5 years, we got the Clean BC version 1, and we now have the roadmap 3 years after that. So I think in terms of bringing action, it's really making sure people can see progress and can see this, you know, they're seeing the impacts. We might as well spend our time focusing on the solutions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just shared a link in chat to the Clean Energy Canada website. I encourage everyone to get signed up to their newsletter. I love reading it every week. It's great. Love to see that email from Sarah in my email box. Lots of good stuff going on, especially around EVs. Some great information there. Lynn's wondering, was it important to build out public EV chargers to increase EV sales? I know that's something we're, you know, sort of grappling with here in Ontario. Is that something that you're seeing more EV chargers around in BC?
Yeah, I think, Lynn, that question is incredibly relevant from this point forward. So up to this point, yes, there's been some deployment. It's largely been private sector. There's certainly been some funding, but that next leap, that massive, you know, turning the corner and having just, you know, most people, I think I saw a number that was like 65% of British Columbians thinking their next car or considering electric car, then that public EV does become a question. I do think there's an interesting consideration, though, to what extent we should be trying to build out electric gas stations versus seeing how electric vehicles and the different technology creates different patterns. So I think there's going to be a far greater need for housing, in houses, in apartment buildings, in condo buildings, because people are going to charge their car at home. They're not going to be out looking for that public charger except when they're entering highways or moving between cities and going longer distances. I think the public charging question is, you know, by far most critical for long distance trucking. And that's, you know, ultimately the deployment of public infrastructure to support the really long distance trucking fleets is going to be essential.
Absolutely. I've got a couple of questions of my own, and then we'll let you take a little bit of a break there, Evan. I know you've been on the hot seat for a bit here. I'm wondering, is BC proof that rebates work? I mean, just going on the Clean BC Better Homes site, there's so many different rebates. We know you've got the EV rebate out there. There's tons of folks who are looking to do heat pumps. Is BC proving that rebates really do work? Some thoughts on rebates?
Yeah, I mean, I think direct sort of financial incentives to help move these pieces is absolutely a benefit. I'm wary of saying any one policy. So, you know, the rebates are sort of the deal breaker. A lot of, you know, I think what it has been a real focus on early adopters and making sure that we're making it, you know, constantly bringing things down so that more and more people can get into it. So the first set of rebates was allowing folks with the financial means to even look at those first models of Tesla. We just made it cheaper for them to buy, you know, one of the more expensive cars on the market. As the costs of electric vehicles have come down, then I think the role of subsidies becomes absolutely massive. And that's across, you know, I mean, you name it, heat pumps, battery electric, you know, personal vehicles, MHDV, all of those places. The more we can help accelerate the cost comparison between the gas or diesel option and the electric or, you know, zero emission option, the greater the uptake is going to be. People, you know, there's not all that much, I think, political opposition to the idea of an electric vehicle. I think in BC, at least, we've moved beyond sort of, I think, some of the scapegoat arguments around range anxiety and other pieces, at least for how most people drive their cars today.
Absolutely. You know, we definitely like to see a few of those out in Ontario for sure. What's one thing that's going on in BC that you'd like to see replicated across Canada, as a final question for you?
Yeah, good question.
So many things, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a few. I think that the most important thing that can happen, that sort of has happened in BC but needs to sort of accelerate across the rest of the country, is putting actual concrete policies in place. So it's not an easy answer. It's not a sort of just this one thing. I mean, I can say, electric vehicles probably would have an outsized impact because of the exposure that they have. You see them on the street, you interact with them. But I think there's this risk of getting caught trying to design comprehensive and perfect policy versus really getting a couple real pieces moving and letting things snowball. I think that's the BC lesson more than anything else. A carbon tax has snowballed awareness to where we have a climate plan, to where we've had a climate plan that reaches 2030 and the policies in place. I'm a pretty big believer things are going to continue to snowball in that direction.
Absolutely. No, it's really inspirational. I know folks are very thankful that you were able to come on and share some knowledge. So really appreciate it. Maybe we'll have you hang tight for any sort of follow-up questions after Lauren's presentation. Just a reminder to stop share. But thanks so much there, Evan, for your presentation. That was fabulous. Really inspirational to hear what's going on at BC. So now let's just follow it east, right, and keep that momentum going. So thanks again there to Evan. So I want to bring on our last speaker for the night, and we are very happy to have Lauren, and she's making a return appearance here on Green Drinks, so she's becoming a bit of a regular. And Lauren Latour joined CanRAC in 2019 as a Climate Ambition Coordinator. What a great title. And having spent several years in grassroots climate justice organizing circles in communities across Canada, Lauren is a graduate of environmental studies and political science at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, where she first became involved in climate justice organizing through campus fossil fuel divestment campaigning, organizing power shift youth conferences, and as a delegate to COP21 and 22 with the Canadian Youth Delegation. Passionate about ensuring we transition to a carbon neutral future in a way that works for all. Lauren is incredibly excited to be working with the network to bring a new Green Deal to Canada, and she was on the ground at the latest COP summit there. So she's going to give us some things that were going on right on the ground in Glasgow, which is exciting, I know, for everybody to hear what was going on there. So welcome in, Lauren. Want to thank you so much for coming back on Green Drinks. Can't believe it's been a year since we chatted last, but you can unmute yourself. You should be good there, and you can share your screen. Thanks again for joining us. Excited to hear about what you've been up to.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for the invitation back, Nick. I really appreciate it. My apologies for folks who were like listening super intently last year, because some of this, obviously introducing people to the network might be old news by now. But I'm going to try my best to keep my presentation to about 15 minutes, so then it gives us enough time to chat and people aren't sitting in front of their computers for too late into the evening. So I will share my screen. We'll see how that goes. And I do apologize. I have a separate screen up with some notes. So yeah, my apologies if I ever have to reference a separate screen there. Where are we? There we go. So like Nick said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the network this evening, and then also a little bit about some of the work we're doing in the upcoming year. And then we'll spend some time chatting about COP, because COP is always weird. But COP was especially weird this year, I'm sure, as a lot of people know, whether or not you were able to attend in person or online, because that was an option for the first time this year. So yeah, so I'm from Climate Action Network Canada. I've recently changed roles. Climate Ambition Coordinator was my favorite title for a job that I've probably ever had, but I've shifted gears a little bit, and I'm now our programming and engagement lead, which I really appreciate, because it was kind of a role that I got to devise myself, and that's always fun when we get to have autonomy over the work that we do. If anybody wants to get in touch with me, my email address is there, super easy to remember, Lauren Latour at climateactionnetwork.ca. I'll bring this slide up again later, so in case anybody has any lingering questions, they can always click on that and get in touch. Where are we? Can I just, how do I progress forward? There we are. Okay. Okay, so introducing folks to Climate Action Network Canada. We're a member-based organization, hence the word network, with about 130 member orgs across the country. Our members aren't individual people, they're various organizations, usually nonprofits, but sometimes other groups get into the network as well. Membership isn't just exclusively sort of like environmental organizations. Like, yes, we have Greenpeace and Environmental Defense and Council of Canadians and sort of the organizations you might expect, but we're also lucky enough to include various communities from sort of not only across so-called Canada, but from a wide variety of various sort of like facets of civil society. We have labor groups and labor unions. We have faith organizations present. We have some Indigenous organizations that are present as members and as network allies as well. So it's basically just everybody coming together. If your organization is focused on climate in any capacity, you're welcome to the table. And essentially, a lot of that network, what we do as an organization falls into three main pillars. We have our member services and network convening, we have our domestic policy work, and then we have our international policy work. And a lot of our work within that sort of member services and network convening is the work that myself and my other colleague Tika do. And that is making sure that we always have a space for folks to come together and communicate and share what's going on in their work and with their campaigns, and information sharing as much as possible to sort of equip the climate movement in Canada as best we can, to make sure that we can be somewhat cohesive and powerful as a movement. So that looks like a lot of webinars under COVID, looks like a lot of Zoom calls, some really, really active email chains and listservs, which are fantastic because it means that there's always a dialogue happening and lots of information sharing happening. It also looks like a little bit of government relations work collectively, which is always really fantastic because it shows that there's a bit of a united front and a united voice. And then, of course, when we are able to be in person, it sometimes looks like pulling together in-person summits or in-person conventions. So for several years in a row, we were able to have ClimateCon, which was really great, awesome space full of learning opportunities and full of networking opportunities for folks from the movement to come together and meet in person, which is always exciting and none of us can wait to get back to. And then the other two pillars of our work are our domestic policy work and our international policy work, which basically are what they sound like. Engagement in pushing domestic policy in the direction that the movement collectively encourages and wants it to go in, can happen. And what's nice about that is it happens in a way that's very much led by the network. It's not a lot of the CANRAC, the staff, we call ourselves the secretariat, and it's not necessarily secretariat led. It's not what we're looking to do. It's what our network is looking to do, and we always take leadership from them. And then international policy work is very much the same, trying really hard to make sure that the commitments that Canada makes on the international stage are reflected in domestic policy and domestic action. And it also looks like making sure that civil society is always able to engage effectively in international proceedings, because a lot of the times those spaces, as you'll hear when we talk about COP a little bit, are really, really closed off to civil society. So we're always trying to make sure that as much as possible, we're providing avenues for Canadian organizations and Canadian communities to plug into what Canada is doing abroad. Yeah, so that's a little bit about what we do. I guess also to summarize, we're a small team. We're only about 8 people. If you're ever looking to get in touch with any of us, you can go to our website, and on the About page, it has all of our staff listed and all of our email addresses. So if you're ever looking to get in touch with somebody from the domestic policy team or the international policy team, all that contact information is available there. Let's see if I can proceed. Okay, yeah, so areas of focus in 2022. This is obviously not a comprehensive list. These are just the things that were at the forefront of my brain over the last couple of days as I put this together. So at the forefront of my work as engagement and programming coordinator lead, can't remember exactly what the title is always making sure that the network is sort of has as many opportunities for learning and growth as possible. So one of the things that we're doing this year as a network, as a secretariat, is overhauling our charter, because the last time our charter was written was about 10, 12 years ago. So although it's nothing that we say in the charter is untrue, it just needs a little bit of updating, especially with the language that's used. And part and parcel to that is some learning that we're doing this year in order to make sure that our goals going forward in the way that we work, both as a network and as a movement, are really justice focused and really emphasizing figuring out what anti-oppression and decolonization look like for a network that is by and large settler, and reflective of a movement that in a lot of ways is very white settler as well. So there's a lot of really awesome work that we're going to be doing around that this year. But from a policy standpoint, specifically from a domestic policy standpoint, our work is really focused on just transition, supply side, and the new climate plan this year. But again, this is not comprehensive. This is a very small snapshot of what we're doing. But just transition, because this is finally, hopefully, the year that we're going to be getting just transition legislation tabled, or at least that work is finally starting. We've heard whispers that the government is going to be starting its consultation period soon, which is really great. Just transition is also really exciting because it's the perfect opportunity and the perfect conversation space for the many facets of the progressive movement to come together and sort of like dream up and ideate. Is that a word? We're just going to say dream up what the world, what we want the world to look like, and what we want so-called Canada to look like in the coming years, and making sure that everybody is provided for. So there's some really awesome conversations that are going to be happening around just transition in 2022 that I myself and everybody at CAN is really excited for. Some supply side conversations are getting really exciting and are really ramping up as well, which is great because I think what everybody wants is for Canada, the federal government at least, to finally acknowledge that like the only way to get to zero emissions is by phasing out the fossil fuel industry. So there's a lot of conversations happening around that this year, which is really exciting. We're potentially, I don't know, seeing the death of liquid natural gas, hopefully, because we're seeing some of those permits either being pulled or being canceled on in sort of like eastern provinces. So that's the kind of like BC and the western provinces are kind of like the last bastion of LNG. And obviously everybody's been hearing so much about what's happening in Wet'suwet'en with Coastal GasLink over the last months and years. So that's obviously big and exciting and happening all the time. We're hearing really good talk about finally ending fossil fuel subsidization in Canada. There were some pledges made internationally that we're hoping to actually see come into play in a meaningful way. And then just some really fantastic finance campaigning work that's been happening in the last couple of years around divestment, targeting banks, targeting Export Development Canada. So some good conversations and some really good campaigning happening there as well that we're keen to support as much as possible. And then finally, there's a new climate plan coming out, which was already plugged, I believe, earlier this evening by Lynn. The official consultation period, of course, they decided to launch on December 13th, and nobody quite knows. It's like, okay, did they launch it over Christmas because they assumed that everybody works over Christmas, or did they launch it over Christmas because they were hoping that nobody would be working over Christmas? Either way, that consultation period wraps up tomorrow. And I believe Lynn posted some resources for people to plug into if they want to give some thoughts into that, because it's specifically this consultation period and the web tool that's available is looking for input from individual people, not necessarily organizations. So it's anybody can contribute that way, which is great. And then from what I understand, that new plan is going to be launched in March. So those are a couple areas of interest that we're going into this year. Oops. Okay. Talking about COP26, because I know that's primarily what people are interested in hearing about. This was just a beautiful image that, of course, I did not come up with, that just kind of encompasses all of the various disparate conversations that were happening at COP this year. And it really was a bizarre year. Tougher in the past. Obviously, every year is hard. It's always difficult being in a space that is so sanitized, and I use that word metaphorically, though this year it was obviously like literally very sanitized as well in order to keep people safe. But sanitized in the sense that it is so removed and so cut off from the realities of climate change. It's frustrating to realize just how slow the negotiation process is at that high level, and that those who are making the decisions are like utterly disconnected from like the traumas of climate change and like the realities of what we're facing in these crises. And it's sort of, when you're in a space like that, when you're in this big conference venue that has been custom built for the purposes of this meeting, and this year it had 10,000 people were allowed in the space at any given time, but 50,000 people were registered. So when you're in a space that's that sort of like cut off from the rest of the world, it's really hard to conceptualize the realities of climate change and what's happening and what people are really facing. And this year, even more so, those things felt stratified and cloistered. Because understanding that even in regular years, spaces are really inaccessible to civil society and to sort of the average person. There's like literally your badge that you have to wear at COP is color coded, so security knows what space you're allowed in and what space you're not allowed in. So those stratifications and those hierarchies are always there, but they were even more present this year because of literal just like capacity restrictions because of COVID. The rooms that in the past would have had several thousand people in them, like the biggest plenary spaces, this year we're limited to like 700 people. So simply because of that, spaces weren't as accessible as they have been. And like I said, accessibility was really limited in the past. Some frustrations immediately arose upon arriving in Glasgow because we were assured over and over and over again as attendees that this would be like a quote unquote regular COP. And yet it wasn't until arriving there that many people realized that individual room access would be as limited to the degree that I said it was, and that many spaces were only available to those with party badges or government badges. And whereas myself or somebody else from CAN was on like a civil society badge or an observer badge. That civil society groups were only going to be allowed in certain spaces on a ticketed basis. So they added this sort of like extra layer of bureaucracy isn't the right word, but like logistical havoc to try to navigate. And unfortunately, it meant that civil society really wasn't allowed in a lot of these spaces at all. So something I didn't explain about Climate Action Network is Climate Action Network Canada is a domestic node of an international organization. And that international organization has a few dozen domestic nodes and regional nodes all over the world. And so that means that Climate Action Network International is kind of an umbrella for thousands and thousands, if not millions, of different people and various organizations. And Climate Action Network International, say, to get into a given room where negotiations were happening, we're given 2 tickets to get into a given space. So that meant for all of the various nodes, only 2 people were going to be allowed to go into a given negotiation room. And if you weren't allowed in those specific negotiation rooms, what you instead were forced to log into was this weird climate change or UNFCCC, so UN Climate Change Conference platform that was like part streaming service, part poorly put together social media hub. It was this weird. Obviously, people worked really, really hard to try to make this platform as accessible as possible, to try to make sure that people could tune into various negotiations and various proceedings. But unfortunately, it presented a huge barrier to people, not just like a physical barrier keeping you out, but like a technological barrier that not everybody is going to be equipped to leap over, especially when they're in a foreign country, especially when they maybe don't speak that language. And also when people have spent so much money to be there. People came to COP from obviously every single country from all over the world, jumped through various vaccine and testing hoops, maybe were quarantined for 10 days upon having to arrive, spent insane amounts of money on flights, insane amounts of money on accommodations. I specifically know 2 people who were going to COP in Glasgow, and by the time they were able to book an Airbnb for 2 weeks, it cost them $7,000. Like, prices were steep. So people spent all this money, went through all this work only to get to COP and realize that they weren't actually going to be able to engage in person in a lot of these negotiation spaces. They were going to have to log into an online platform and essentially watch what was happening on a Zoom, basically zooming into these rooms. So incredibly, incredibly frustrating for people and really disheartening. And it actually ended up, it was like the human rights special rapporteurs ended up sending letters to the UK presidency and the UNFCCC, sort of like demanding some restorative action here to make sure that civil society would be allowed into some of these rooms. Because in a lot of ways, civil society represents sort of like the conscience of COP. We're the ones who were there saying like phrases like 1.5 to survive wouldn't have been on the COP radar if civil society hadn't been there. Pushes for things like loss and damage wouldn't happen without civil society there representing like the world's most marginalized peoples. So this was a really disappointing year in that sense, because even more so than usual, it was difficult to engage, and especially so because it was realized about halfway through COP. I think somebody finally published the story, because they every year at COP, the attendee list is released, and it's just this massive 1,000-page long PDF. And somebody went through and counted and realized that the biggest non-government delegation present at COP was fossil fuel industry lobbyists. There were about 500 fossil fuel industry lobbyists there. So when the fossil fuel industry is present at this conference in such a real and tangible way, it becomes that much more important for voices from non-government organizations and various communities to be present and to be able to speak loudly and to be able to be heard. And I guess sort of like one last thing to sort of demonstrate how weird and difficult this space was. I attended COP in a supporting role to CanRAC policy staff this year. Basically, my job was supposed to be kind of twofold. I was supposed to be like the logistical point person to help our staff and to help the network, because lots of members of the network and from Canadian civil society are present at any given COP. So I was supposed to be a logistical point person there, but I was also supposed to be on hand to kind of do some like movement and grassroots liaising to sort of bridge the gap between the ENGO world, or the environmental nonprofit or environmental non-government organization world, and the grassroots community, because sometimes there can be a bit of a gap, bit of a canyon between those two groups. And I unfortunately really wasn't able to do any work with grassroots communities, because my time was just completely taken up trying to help my team and trying to help the network navigate this impossible space. Because even when instructions did come, they were constantly changing, rules were constantly shifting. And of course, when you're trying to communicate new rules to 50,000 people, that's a hard task. And unfortunately, the challenge wasn't always met in the best way by the organizers of COP. So anyway, that's a bit about my personal experience. But in terms of actual like policy outcomes, this year was a really big year for flashy announcements, in addition to some real breakthroughs. Obviously, any year where, so COP obviously happens every year, but what doesn't happen every year is the global like leadership summit. And this year was a global leadership summit year. I think the last one was in Paris back at COP 21. So what that means is that for the first couple of days of COP, over like 100 heads of state will be present. It'll be like one of the highest security places in the entire world, because you've got presidents and prime ministers and chancellors from all over the world coming together. And of course, when you've got somebody who's head of state there, you're going to get some big flashy announcements. And we did get those, making pledges on coal phase out, making pledges for new subsidies, pledges on deforestation and finance. A good one that did come out was the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance was like formally launched, which is this really great initiative between several countries who are pledging to phase out oil and gas in the near future. Canada is of course not a signatory, though Quebec is. So there were some really good announcements made. But what also happens with something like that is we had some really fantastic pledges that aren't necessarily realized in policy yet, or even in a plan or in Canada's NDC yet. So the big thing to pay attention to, especially going into 2022, is going to be seeing how many of those beautiful pledges actually are actualized in our plans and in our policy as we're going forward. I'll come back to this slide in a second, but there was a great graphic, put out by Climate Action Tracker. And what this is trying to demonstrate is sort of the gap between like what is actually like what our target, what emissions actually look like under current policies and actions, and what it is sort of under those pledges. Because what ended up a big talking point that came out, especially later on in that first week and in that second week of COP, is that we're on track for 1.8 degrees of warming, which is still over 1.5, but is relatively close to 1.5. That was a really big talking point being parroted by not only the COP presidency, but by a lot of larger, more developed countries, is that we're on track for 1.5. It's going to be great. Don't you worry. But what you realize is that's a scenario that's pretty optimistic and is a best case scenario, and is actually just based off of the accumulation of all of the like big announcements and targets that came out during COP. Where we're still actually realistically sitting is closer to 2.7 if we're taking into account actual policies and actions. If you're taking into account 2030 targets, which is still good, we're at 2.4. So there's a big gap there between what's been promised and what what is actively being delivered on right now. But back over to the highlights. Another exciting thing that came out of COP26, which is kind of part and parcel to that first sort of flashy announcement point, but is meaningful, is the launch of the Glasgow Climate Pact, and it's a process to keep 1.5 within reach, to kind of keep the Paris goal alive. And part of that came with like a pledge to reduce unabated coal usage, which is exciting. Also part of that is like there's a global goal on adaptation that's been put into progress. And loss and damage finally got some good attention after years and years and years of being sidelined and ignored, especially by Western nations. Loss and damage is finally being discussed. And I guess, I'm sure most of you know this, but just in case for those who don't, loss and damage is sort of like this third pillar of climate finance. You have climate finance going towards adaptation and mitigation, concepts I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And then there's this third pillar, this loss and damage pillar. And that's the idea that Western or wealthier nations need to be putting money into loss and damage funds for more developing nations or nations that are more at risk of climate change impacts, because there are some things that you cannot adapt for and you cannot mitigate for. There are simply things that will be lost and will be damaged as a result of climate change, and wealthier nations need to be accounting for that. So that finally started to be addressed in official COP spaces, which is very positive, and again, only happened because of really, really fantastic, really dedicated work from civil society and grassroots communities. And finally, fossil fuels were actually mentioned in formal text, which is great, and is the first time that has ever happened, which is shocking when you realize that this was the 26th conference of the parties to happen. Finally, another big takeaway is that huge finance gaps still do remain. It was good that the $100 billion $100 billion US climate finance commitment was actually at the heart of negotiations this year, which is awesome. And there is a focus on adaptation and a post 2025 goal. But unfortunately, that is now inadequate. It was adequate maybe 5 years ago, or closer to adequate 5 years ago. It is now inadequate because things have progressed farther. And unfortunately, the type of finance and the question around the type of finance still remains. So what I mean by type of finance is like the idea that it's great that Western nations are pledging money towards the global South, but if that's in the form of a loan, that's only further indenturing that country in sort of poverty and economic strife. What we need to see is that when these dollars are going to more vulnerable nations, they're going in the form of grants in order to make sure that we're not just further indebting people. Now, obviously, some good things did come out of COP. One of the more exciting things is that on November 6th, there was the climate march, and throughout the 2 weeks of COP, there was the People's Climate Summit. And these are some of the best things that always come out of COP, are the way that grassroots communities show up outside of the space and really bring those voices and those important points to the forefront. When I've been asked in the past, well, like, what's something good that came out of COP? It's always the momentum that's built within grassroots spaces and within civil society. Because not every COP is a big sort of like landmark banner year. Oftentimes it goes by kind of ignored and unacknowledged by the rest of the world. But about every 5 years, when it's a big stocktake year like this one, we finally get some headline space, and it results in some like renewed enthusiasm, some renewed vigor around climate change. So this was one of those big years, and it was really fantastic to see. And a lot of people got a lot of energy and a lot of strength from things like the November 6th march. Oh, I've already seen that. Okay, where do we go from here? Some things to look for as it pertains to sort of COP in the coming months and years, as we, of course, gear up for COP27, which we already know will be in Egypt next November. Around ambition, we really need to revise our current inadequate pledges. As most of you know, Canada's most recent pledge, which was announced back in April, is that by 2030, we'll reduce below 2005 levels, or we'll reduce 40 to 45% below 2005 levels. It's this maddening window that I don't want to talk about anymore right now because it makes me upset, but we need to revise those inadequate pledges. We need to scale up our adaptation action, especially here in Canada. And of course, we need to finance action on loss and damage. Finally, or further to that, there's a note around transparency. We really need to enhance our transparency on how climate finance flows, to make sure, like I said, that we're getting things like grants instead of loans. We need to cooperate. We need to see a whole government approach when implementing these pledges, not just sort of like everything falling under the purvey of ECCC. And then we do need to see, obviously, implementation. We need to ensure that these pledges are reflected in our NDC. I think a lot of the times there's a bit of a misconception that our NDC is just our climate target, and it's not. It needs to be a comprehensive plan that reflects how these pledges are going to be enacted in reality at the domestic level. And then we need to clarify our intentions on Article 6, which I didn't even touch on. And Article 6 is the conversation that's happening around, it refers to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and Article 6 deals with carbon markets. We need to clarify what Canada's intentions around those carbon markets are, and if it is in fact just a Trojan horse for offsets that don't work and aren't real. So yeah, I'm sorry I went way longer than I said I would with my 15 minutes. But yeah, eager to see if anybody has any questions. But if nobody has any questions, that's okay too.
No worries. No, I think it was everybody really appreciated enjoying hearing kind of the insider perspective on COP26 there. Really, really important to hear some of those reflections.
Sorry if it was a bummer.
No. I think it's a realistic look, right? So, I think when you look at sort of news articles and you see little media clips, you get a kind of glorified version of things. So it's really nice to see, some things that are kind of from the ground level, right? So I know we did have a few questions in here. So let me kind of go through them. If anybody's got any questions for Lauren, add them into chat there. Janet was just wondering, why so-called Canada? I think that was at the beginning of your presentation. Janet, we may need to, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, totally. So the reason I would choose to use a word like so-called Canada is because the idea of Canada is this kind of like weird colonial construct. There's a whole lot of folks across this massive swath of land that don't necessarily acknowledge that Canada is a legitimate nation state. So I just sort of, I use that term, so-called Canada, to sort of acknowledge that in the eyes of many, if we are going to actively decolonize in a real way, it's going to some degree affect how we refer to the nation. The nation, it's weird, it's nebulous. Sorry, it's my small effort to sort of contextualize things a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, no, I get it. I figured that. George was wondering, what are some volunteer or community engagement opportunities open to the public to assist in this just transition? Has there been any mention of active BIPOC collaborative engagement strategies for Climate Action Network in 2022 and beyond? So I guess a bit of a two-part question there.
Yeah, so starting with that first question, yeah, it's hard because it's not necessarily as simple as CANRAC deciding we want more BIPOC members, because in reality, what it means to sort of grow our BIPOC membership and those relationships of allyship look like us actually digging deep and figuring out how, like, the services that we could be meaningfully offering to various BIPOC communities and organizations. Because if we're just sort of carrying on with business as usual and saying, oh, but you're invited to the table this time, then that's putting the onus on those BIPOC communities. And so what we need to do is make sure that, like, the services that we're providing are not just adequate, but like targeted and actually meaningfully useful. And that when we do have a new BIPOC organization potentially coming to the table and coming to a meeting, that they're feeling like they're welcome and that their what they're offering is being well received and that they're actually receiving good service in return. So we're doing some part of that sort of journey that we're going on as a network and as a secretariat is, like I said, we're putting ourselves through a series of trainings basically this year to figure out what actively, using this word is can feel kind of tokenistic, but like what actually, like, quote unquote, decolonizing our structures and our work actually looks like, so that we're making sure that we're acting in service of those communities. So it's long, and we haven't necessarily figured out what our, like, what our plan of action is, because first we need to do a lot of educating, a lot of learning, a lot of unlearning, and a lot of paradigm shifting in how we operate, again, not just as a staff and as a network, but also as a movement, and how we show up in larger spaces as well. And sorry, your question was also how people can plug in. We are, like I said, we're a membership-based organization. So unfortunately, it's like, I can't say sign CanRAC's petition because we don't have petitions. What we do is we uplift the work of our network members. So what I would do is, or what I would recommend is to is to like point you in the direction of like a local organization to your community to plug in either at the municipal or the provincial or even the federal level with sort of whatever existing group speaks to you. Because I think one of the other things that like newer activists or newer organizers think when they come to the table is like, oh my God, I have to start from scratch. There isn't a group in my community that's already doing this work. I have to devise it myself and build up these networks myself. And you don't. Somebody in your community is almost inevitably already doing this work. You just have to spend enough time Googling to find those people. And if you are looking for specific people, I'll put my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to me. I can probably help point you in the direction of an already existing community that you can plug into to push these things. And specifically, if you're looking for groups to plug into that are doing just transition work, I can kind of help target you towards that as well.
Yeah, that would be great. I know a few other folks were looking for your contact email, so that would be great. A couple other questions for you, and then we'll get you to throw that into chat. Andrea is wondering around the food sector realm, how do you see the path ahead for plant-based diets in Canada? Research shows LCA's life cycle analysis converging on finding plant-based food production has much lower GHG emissions. Is that something you deal with?
Yeah, so plant-based diets are a tricky one. And I think there's a lot of frustration from a lot of people because we do know that meat and growing meat is so carbon intensive. But what I think we as, especially as a representative of a network that is, again, largely white and largely settler, need to acknowledge is that a vegan or a vegetarian diet is highly accessible to somebody in a southern province or somebody in a southern region, especially for me as somebody in Ottawa and as somebody who is like relatively financially stable. But that's not going to be the same for somebody who is in a different socioeconomic bracket, or especially somebody from a territory that's maybe a little more north, a little more remote. So as much as we can probably encourage, like I can encourage my peers to not eat meat, or I can choose to not eat meat, it becomes really hard for us to sort of dictate what folks from various communities can do, because that's not always going to be helpful or useful for them, nor is it necessarily going to be the most sustainable thing. Because again, yes, it's the most sustainable thing for me to do as a white woman living in Ottawa. It's not going to be the most sustainable thing for somebody in a northern community to do, right? So I think that's why there's a lot of frustration around those conversations about food, because it is so personal, it is so individualized, and unfortunately it isn't one of those things that's like that can be sort of like handed down from the gods as gospel truth. That being said, when it comes to issues around agriculture, there are some really fantastic organizations doing really awesome work around agriculture. There's some great farmers unions doing good work to make sure that going forward, agriculture and that industry is as sustainable as possible, understanding that it is such a big facet of our economy, and that operations do need to change in a number of different ways in order to make it more sustainable. So yeah, I would encourage folks to plug into those organizations as much as possible. And again, I can point you in the direction of them if you're looking to support in any significant way.
That's great. Thanks so much. So I've got a couple more questions for you on COP, and then maybe we'll bring in Evan and Kirstin just for some final thoughts. I'm wondering, we heard a lot of net zero pledges, and a lot of folks were thinking this was a bit of greenwashing. What are your thoughts around those net zero pledges? I'm thinking like Microsoft and some of those other ones that sort of came out. Or are you thinking it's pretty fluffy? Are you seeing some real substance there? Talk to us a little bit about some of those pledges.
It's really hard. The concept of net zero is one that for the longest time, I know the climate community pushed, but what I'm seeing increasingly, and it's exciting to see, is people calling for like true zero instead of net zero, because with net, what you're kind of leaving the door open for is a reliance on unproven removal technologies and offsets and sequestration. And some folks would argue that those will need to be used in some capacity. But the fear is with a country or a given company adopting a net zero approach, it's that they're going to, instead of relying on those removal technologies or those offset technologies to deal with like the last dregs of their emissions in 10 or 15 years, is that they're going to overly rely on them in the short term and say, no, we're fine. We're net zero by 2030. And it's like, okay, but like how much of that is actual emissions reduction and how much of that is you saying we're planting 2 billion trees, don't worry about it. So anytime somebody uses net zero, it's a bit of a red flag, doubly so if it's a corporation, because like, let's be real, these are money-making bodies. The degree to which they actually give a shit is limited. Pardon my language. And then when you are looking at something specifically like Microsoft pledging to go net zero, what we do need to look at is whether they're incorporating scope 3 into those pledges. So scope 3, it's like you've got scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. And scope 3 emissions are those kind of like once you have produced the oil and shipped it overseas and somebody else is then burning it in their car, unless you're incorporating those, like scope 3 is like the burning of the fuel in the car and the emissions that result from that. So unless you've got a company that's taking those scope 3 emissions into account, again, they're not really taking responsibility for all of the emissions that result from their product. So that's why I'm always a little bit wary when I hear a corporate net zero pledge. And then, yeah, just the concept of net zero in general is something that I know, at least myself, I'm trying not to use as much in my in my chosen language. I instead am reaching for terms like true zero or absolute zero to indicate that like we need to actually reduce tangible emissions and not just rely on CCUS.
Absolutely, no, for sure. And just a couple words about the global carbon offset market. I know that's something that we heard quite a bit of. Were you sort of seeing some good traction for that market, or was that something that was kind of left hanging at COP26? Say a few words on that.
It wasn't left totally hanging. Article 6 was definitely like discussed really to the point of like exhaustion throughout those 2 weeks. I hesitate to say too much on it because it's one of those aspects that I feel is like so utterly beyond my knowledge. One of my coworkers, Pratisha Singh, is like a total expert on it now because that was the negotiation thread that she followed all throughout COP. So I can definitely try to compile some thoughts around Article 6 and those global carbon markets and send them off to you if that's helpful, if people are curious. But what I will say is basically it's like, where we're at with the global carbon market conversation is sort of where we're at with the net zero conversation. It's that how much of this will be just allowing wealthy nations the permission to continue to burn to burn fossil fuels and then just like purchase offsets from another country. It's where that becomes dubious and where that becomes questionable. So I think that's why so many people, what ended up happening with Article 6, I'm now remembering, is that like it's not that negotiations stalled, but we didn't get to an endpoint. And civil society, generally speaking, agreed on the idea that no plan is better than a bad plan, because a bad plan truly sets us up for failure in the coming decades. So people are willing to hold out until we get an Article 6 or global markets plan that's like really airtight and really puts equity at the forefront, as opposed to something that's sort of wishy-washy and just allows for a lot of nasty, kind of insidious trading. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, thanks so much. So a couple of wrap-up questions for everybody. Not sure if Kirstin's still there and she wants to come on and chat. I've got a general wrap-up question from Alex, and then I've got one from myself. So we'll kind of go around to the panel here. What initiatives are taking place to nationalize energy efficiency? For example, set up a public-private entity or crown corporation to manufacture and install affordable heat pumps for heating and water for all Canadians. So great question, Alex. Maybe let's go over to Kirstin, then we'll maybe hear from Evan, and then if Lauren wants to pipe in on any of that. So great question, Alex.
Yeah, I would say offhand on energy efficiency, I don't know of any examples, but would love to hear about it. But a really cool initiative that's been going on is Green Jobs Oshawa, which is they had I don't want to get the company wrong, I think it was a GM plant that got shut down, and they came together asking to nationalize the plant to produce electric fleet vehicles. So I think that's a really, really interesting example of labor kind of coming together in this, you know, the words are escaping me, but I think that's a really cool example of nationalizing in favor of climate.
Yeah, absolutely. Evan, did you have a few words on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm watching, there's two pieces. One is what comes out of the federal government, everything to do with the national energy standard, looking at that sort of national clean energy standard, how they engage with the other provinces, but also their work in bringing together the provinces and utilities. I think there's a new table that's being built, and I know I've seen their website and the name has escaped me for the moment, but they're trying to assemble a lot more national conversations with some of the key stakeholders there. This really doesn't happen without utilities. And we've got such a mixture of public and private kind of models across the country that there really is a need to talk through a lot of very complicated questions about how we're going to build out things like smart grids and other things that enable a lot of interesting efficiency opportunities. So those would be the pieces I'm looking at.
That's great. Lauren, are you looking at anything kind of national programs, initiatives? You're still on mute there.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. No, that was just to sort of excuse myself from this conversation because it's an area in which I'm largely ignorant. I would just end up saying something probably offensive about how public-private partnerships always make me really nervous. So I'll hush.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, we're definitely tracking it at SmartNet Alliance. We're trying to educate folks and bring businesses together with sort of municipalities like the city of Ottawa and get homeowners and folks moving in the right direction. We do have a couple of other webinars coming up in February, so I'll share those into chat. I wanted one last question for all the panel goers. So let's just say you had a genie you could rub and you got one wish. What's the one thing around climate policy that you would like to see in 2022? One big wish. We'll start with you, Kirstin. Could be anything. What's the one big thing you'd like to see in 2022 on climate policy?
Oh, geez, put us on the spot.
Yeah, I probably should have emailed you guys this before, but hey, get you working for your answers here.
Yeah, I feel like whatever comes to your mind first, that's what you truly want. So I think it would be a national energy poverty strategy for Canada. That would be my big wish.
Great, thanks so much. Evan, so some wishes. Any one big wish? Would it be like a bigger EV rebate, or what are you thinking? What would be your one wish across Canada?
I'd really like to see comprehensive worker transition policy linked to reaching net zero goals. I think that's, for me, that would make it most real, and that would allow us to move beyond some, I think, the entrenched political lines into some real change.
Fabulous. Lauren, you've got one last wish here, the third wish.
Pie in the sky would be for the government to commit to like fossil fuel phase out within the next couple decades in like a real and tangible way that doesn't leave anybody behind. Fingers crossed.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. I want to thank our speakers so much for tonight. Sorry if we weren't able to get everybody's questions in, but we tried our best. I want to thank Kirstin so much. Evan from out in BC. Great to connect and hear about some great opportunities out there. Lauren, it was awesome to have you back on another edition. You're getting to be a regular, so we'll have to get you a jacket made or something like that. But thanks so much. I always love our climate action editions because it's great to get inspired, to hear about what's going on, to hear a little bit about some of the organizations that are out there. Hopefully folks kind of caught a little bit of inspiration to get their year started. I want to thank everybody so much for joining us. Remember that we're back in February for our green drinks focused on B Corps, so that'll be a great one on the 10th. And then we have our home retrofit webinar the following week on the 17th. We'll be talking about some important facets like panel upgrades, insulation, air tightness, windows and doors, all that fun stuff. We get really technical on those, so we can go deep and answer a lot of your questions. So once again, want to thank everybody so much. We're right at the 2-hour mark, so this is great. Rar's been giving us a little bit of drumming, which is great. Thanks so much, Rar. And want to really appreciate everybody for coming in. Once again, thanks so much. This is Nick at SmartNet Alliance, and I'm wishing everybody a great year ahead. Take care.